You know where the Station Avenue car park, which is obviously Tesco, well, was that a training ground on there?
Yes, well, moved 1937 across the road from the house where I was born on Station Avenue. But it was a field initially, and then I think they did lay it out with tarmac, and that was a training area. And in fact, we have a photograph in the museum somewhere that you might have seen, Victoria, of troops actually on the field. But that was First World War. But Second World War, they made it into a parade ground for drilling. So that was that. Oh yes, one of the things that they did to take account of the fact that invasion might take place, they said, well, we will have to make it as difficult as possible for enemy troops occupying Filey. And so first of all, they took up the accesses onto the beach. So, where there is the bridge in the middle of the promenade, under that bridge was one of the biggest blockhouses I've ever seen. I mean, it virtually filled the whole of the space under the bridge, so that that particular access could not be used by any troops coming in off the beach. And they dug up the accesses at the end of Church Ravine and Martin's Ravine as well. So there's only one place where you could get off the beach into the town, or from the town onto the beach, and that was a cobble landing. And so they did actually make it as difficult as possible. But fishing did take place throughout the war. So there were probably 15 or 20 cobbles that carried on fishing during the war. And so they made a space just wide enough to enable a tractor or horses to get a cobble from the cobble landing onto the beach and into the water. But that was the only access point. So it really was a very changed situation. In order to make things more difficult for enemy forces to move around, they said, well, we'll make it difficult for them to use a road at this point or at that point. And on Scarborough Road, where it is joined by the Croft, they actually did build a road block. So they built out from one side of the road in a big stone wall, and at the other side of the wall as well they built another, so that there's only about that much space between, so that if you were going along Scarborough Road, you had to take a turn in going through the relatively narrow space between the two roadblocks. And if invasion had taken place, what they also did was to dig holes in the space between the blocks, and so if invasion had taken place very quickly, they would have some steel girders that they would simply drop into the holes and then cement them in, so that the roadblock would be fairly complete, at least for a while. So there were one or two like that. That was the one I particularly remember, where the Croft actually joined Scarborough Road. And they did the same, of course, in much greater numbers in Scarborough. And I do remember going into Scarborough by bus along Filey Road, and you go up and down rather like that as you go into Scarborough. And at the foot of one, they did build quite a serious roadblock, like the ones I've just described. And if you went to Scarborough to go shopping, you always went on the East Yorkshire double-decker bus at 20 minutes to 2, and you would pay if you're an adult, you would pay 1 and 6 for a return ticket. And I can still remember going into Scarborough, and on a double-decker bus and going along Filey Road, and the driver would head for the very narrow gap at the bottom of the hill, and you just hoped that there wasn't another double-decker bus coming the other way also heading. As far as I know, no crashes took place, but whichever way you were going, you had to head for this very narrow space, which was just sufficient for a bus or a lorry. Let me go on a little bit further.
Very interesting.
Well, it was, yeah, and I can remember quite a lot about it. Butlins, of course, was in the process of being built through the war. The reason being that Butlin had his camp at Skegness, which I think was opened in about 1938, just before the war. Anyway, obviously it was successful because he came up to Filey to look for a site for another holiday camp. And so the story is that he went to Primrose Valley and said to them there, is there a place here where I can build a holiday camp? And so they said, don't think so really. And so he looked over the hedge and said, looking to the south, saw quite a lot of farm fields, and he said, who does that own? And so they told him, so he went to see the farmer, and he said, and I can never remember whether he said, I will think about it, come back in a month. And so he went back in a month, and he said, either I'll sell you 100 acres at £200 an acre, or 200 acres at £100 an acre. I can't remember which one to do that. And so that was arranged. So obviously then he had to get planning permission. So he went to Filey Urban District Council and said, can I have planning permission to build a holiday camp on this particular site between Primrose Valley and Hummerby Gap? And the members of Filey Urban District Council said they would think about it, and they conferred, and then they said, never, that's the last. Filey is a select resort, highly regarded, by the nice people. So a holiday camp is the very last thing we want in Filey. So Butlin was not deterred. So he talked to a few folk, changed his plans somewhat, and resubmitted them. And they said, great, just what Filey needs, something to widen its potential number of visitors. And so he now got the site, he now got planning permission, and so he began to build. But then, of course, fairly soon after, war broke out. And of course, that meant that holiday camps were a long way from people's thinking. But Butlin still wanted to carry on with it as another camp. And so he went to Hobbelisha, the war office, at the War Office, and said, I know that you are paying £215 per unit of accommodation for the new camps you are building across the country. He said, I will do the same job for £175 to the same standard. If at the end of the war I can have the buildings back at the same price. And so they said, that's a great idea, yes. And so right through the war they carried on building Butlins, first of all for its immediate use as a place for military occupancy, and finally as a holiday camp. So how they did it I don't know, but they carried on building Butlins with those two objects, and they managed to combine those two intentions into one building. And so by 1945 the War Department said you can have half of Butlins back. So half in 1945 to 46, half was still occupied by the military and half was a holiday camp. So that's really how it started, and it was successful, and they carried on building. I worked there through the 50s, and it was a great place to work at. It was great. I still have it to smile when David probably wouldn't remember Billy Dixon, who was in the police force here, and the police had their own house just next to the vicarage. And Billy Dixon, he was a local lad of the Dixon family. But one thing Billy Dixon did during his service, he stopped Billy Butlin driving down Muston Road and checked his road licence, which was out of date. So he took him to court, and Butlin was fined £1 for driving with an out-of-date road licence. So that was Butlin. But of course, the holiday camp became very successful, and the more applications they had for holiday makers, the more they carried on building. So they built on more and more chalets, more and more places where people could eat, or in the dining halls, or entertain themselves. And they built a boating lake at the front with a little railway around it. The only thing left of Butlin's is the railway station, and it is there virtually. Have you seen it?
I have. I've seen photographs of it. Yeah.
Well, you can always go and have a look at it, but you have to look over the hedge at the other side of the road from where the camp was, and they built the railway station, so it was possible to board a train in King's Cross or Glasgow or Liverpool or Sheffield and go straight to Butlins. It had its own special trains, which all only ran, of course, on a Saturday, because in those days everybody moved on a Saturday. You began your holiday on this Saturday probably and then went home again the following Saturday. But that was it. But as far as I recall, it is pretty well still complete, and the local farmer, I think, still keeps his bales of hay and straw on the platforms. But you can't see it as you drive past. You have to stand on the footpath and look over the hedge. And that was opened in 1947, so that it was possible. It was on a triangular 2 lines to join the main Scarborough to Hull line, so it was possible to drive up. Yes,
you could turn them round on that.
Yeah.
My granddad, that was one of his stations he took over.
Oh yes,
he actually, I remember going with him when he was inspecting everything
yes.
that was going to be ordered the day before.
Yes.
The great opening.
Oh,
and I don't know whether he attended the opening.
Well, we have something in the museum in the far room upstairs about it for the opening. Yeah, they had a big dinner, and I forget who came to open it, but yeah. And of course, in later years, when Scarborough, of course, had a turntable for steam hauled trains going from York to Scarborough, so they would run into Scarborough, then the locomotive would go and be turned round on the turntable for its return journey to York. And then for some reason they said, we don't need this anymore, and so they took it away, demolished it. So that when they began again to run special steam hauled trains, and they wanted to turn the locomotives round, they used to run them down to Butlins, and they ran in from Scarborough, and then the locomotive would reverse and go on the other spur back onto the Scarborough line, and then run it back to Scarborough. So that I can remember on a Saturday morning, sometimes 3 or 4 steam locomotives all joined together, going through Filey on the way to Butlins to be turned round to go back to Scarborough. So that so Butlins was very important to Filey one of the major units that were billeted there were quite a big contingent of West Indians, and they used to come to Filey, and I can still see them. Of course, it comes straight from the West Indies, and I think it was winter time, and they couldn't stop shivering, and I can remember seeing them walking through Filey, still shivering. So that was the West Indians.
Wasn't when Butlins was there, and obviously it's not there now, wasn't the swimming pool, the parade ground, was that originally the parade ground? It was called Humlumby, was it?
Humlumby Moor.
Yes.
Yeah.
RAF station, yes. Because it became an RAF station, Humlumby Moor RAF station. And there was a parade ground right at the front. And of course at the end of the war, they didn't need a parade ground anymore, so they simply blocked up a stream, put a wall around it, and made a boating lake actually. And there was it took them a long time to fill it because it was only a small stream, and it took them a long time. So they stand and joke in failure. I see the tide's still out of Butlins, because they only managed to cover half the parade ground with water. So yes, that was how it originated as a parade ground.
Were there any refugees in Filey, or
no?
The Free French came, didn't they?
The Free French came in quite large numbers and were billeted because Filey had lots of boarding houses which were available for military occupancy. Yes. Now I sometimes have said in giving this talk, I've said, Filey would have quite big movements of troops in and out of Filey, coming into Filey probably for a few weeks to train and then moving on. And I said people were just saying, oh, such and such a regiment have come and now they've gone, and that would be it. But suddenly Filey became full of hundreds of young Frenchmen in uniform, and that had a major effect on the local ladies who are from miles around. And so suddenly people say, the Free French are here, and suddenly, yes, they as I say, the arrival of hundreds of young Frenchmen. Why this should be, I don't know. but it happened. But lots of friendships were made actually. And I can remember this house during the war was occupied some friends of ours, Dick Smart, who had a wholesale sweet business. They were very hospitable to the French. And I can remember meeting 2 or 3 of the Free French actually in this room, and those friendships continued after the war. And so Moira Smart, who lived here, she went and spent 1 or 2 holidays in France with some of the Free French who had been stationed here during the war. So during the war there were quite a lot of genuine friendships made between the troops who were stationed here and the people who lived here, which continued for a long time after the war. And I can in the villages as well, friendships were made. So that was another, I suppose, positive effect on Filey of the war.
Luftwaffe coming in and going on to bombs. Where were the anti-aircraft guns based anyway?
Yeah.
Where would they be based, Michael?
Usually about a couple of miles out. I can remember one anti-aircraft gun unit, was it Graffito? If you come down from the Dottrell to Humlumby, down that road there's a farm. You come fairly quickly to a farm with some trees around. I can remember an anti-aircraft gun unit there. But during the war, on particular nights, you could count up to about 30 searchlights. If they were anticipating enemy aircraft, up to about 30. So it was quite well protected in that respect from anti-aircraft guns and searchlights as well.
So they'd be back more than just on the coast round here then?
Oh yes, so all the way, particularly the east coast, of course, and
Right,
lots and
right.
lots of anti-aircraft units.
Right.
So one of the things that I remember, and I think this is a correct memory, Hull, of course, was very, very seriously bombed. And some would say it was the most heavily bombed city in the whole country.
Right.
By the end of the war, it was estimated that out of all the property in Hull, 95% had either been destroyed or damaged. It's huge, can you imagine that? And I think something like 6,000 people were killed in Hull, so it was very, very seriously hit by bombing. And I'm sure this is a true memory that on some nights you could look to the south and the sky would glow red. If you look to the west, of course, and the sky glowed red, it would mean that it was a nice sunset. But if you look to the south and the sky was red, you had the very sobering thought that it was red because of the property that was on fire in Hull. So yeah, very, very serious thing, of course. Today you can stand in the Crescent Gardens and look out to sea and you won't see a single ship. Probably just one or two very small sailing boats perhaps.
Right.
But during the war, of course, there was huge movement of goods by ship and up and down the coast. And in those days, virtually every ship of any significance was in a convoy. So it was possible to look out to sea, say in the early 1940s, and perhaps see a convoy of 30 or 40 ships, all being shepherded by frigates, destroyers, as they moved very slowly up and down the coast. And of course, one of the major concerns was mines. Mines, the Germans laid minefields just off the coast, particularly seriously in the First World War, but also in the Second World War as well. And so, at the end of the brig, where there is now a bird observatory, or was, I don't know whether it's still there because I've not been on the brig for a long time. At the end of Carnays, there was a cafe where you quite a good one as well. Again, we've got photographs in the museum, and I think in December '39, I think a mine broke loose from its mooring just off the coast, floated in, hit the brig, and exploded and demolished the cafe. In a way, it didn't matter because you weren't allowed to go on the brig anyway. But that was one of the first serious incidents involving a mine. There were occasions when mines might be observed drifting, and they would clear the whole of the promenade in case it exploded on contact with the promenade. And so they would tell everybody who lived on the seafront to move up into town just in case. One never did, very fortunately. But Filey Urban District Council did say to the Fishermen's Society, because there was a lot of fishing, as I say, went on a lot of cobbles because it was a major source of food. And so fishing did continue through the war. But Filey Urban District Council, being aware of the danger of a mine floating in and exploding, they said to the Fishermen's Society, if any of your members observe a mine drifting into Filey Bay, lasso it and take it away. And if you do, we'll give you £5. So I never came across any reference to a fisherman actually claiming the £5. I mean, they said, take it away, but you could sort of read the subtext. Go and leave it off Scarborough somewhere now, but get it away from Filey. So that was a brilliant piece of a brilliant offer to Filey fishermen. So that, yes, mines were a serious part of the war. Again, thinking about air raids, in addition to the Anderson shelters that I talked about, if you wanted an indoor shelter, you could acquire a Morrison shelter, and you could erect those in a room. And as I say, we lived across the road, and we had a Morrison shelter, which was erected for us in our front room, and it was so heavy because it was simply a very extensive iron sheet, probably about that thick, on 4 corner posts. But it was so heavy that before you got one, they would have to strengthen the floor. So the floor had to be strengthened with piles of bricks between the earth and the wooden floor. And so that was a Morrison shelter. Very good for children. It was a marvellous thing to play in. You could put cushions under. It was about that high. It was about like the size of a dining table. So you could put cushions in. It was a lovely place to play for young children. So that was the Morrison shelter. Also, being aware of the possibility of invasion, one of the things we were recommended to do would be to hide our valuables under the floor. And I can still remember hiding our best pottery under the floorboards in the sitting room at the back of the house. And I said to a subsequent owner of the house, I can remember hiding under this particular floor all our best pieces of brass or silver or pottery. And I said, I can remember putting them underneath. I said, I can't remember getting them out again at the end of the war. He said, well, I will, when I go home, I'll have a look, and if I find any, I will let you know. Well, he never let me know. So I presume that we actually had taken them out. So that was another thing that we did, taking the floorboards and putting our best items of our possession under the floorboards. You were recommended during air raids, of course, to take cover, but I can still remember people on this particular street, if the siren sounded, they'd all stand at the front door and said, can you hear anything? Oh yes, it's I think it's one of theirs, oh, we better take cover then, or else. I can still remember a neighbour who lived just along here. He said, they're going down north, he said. Now I always thought you went up north and down south, and I can still remember him saying, yes, I can hear one, it's going down north. So yeah, so in some respects people took it very seriously, and in some respects, because one thing about Filey and air raids, there was nothing strategic around here, that if you heard German aircraft going over, they would be going somewhere more important like Leeds or Sheffield or even Liverpool. And so you didn't worry so much about German bombers coming in. It was the German bombers going out that you were a bit apprehensive about, because if they'd been somewhere and hadn't been able to reach their intended target and turn for home, if they had any bombs left, they would say, oh, let's drop them now before they got over the North Sea. And so they did, so we used to worry about the bombers going back rather than the bombers coming in. Yeah, cycling, of course, was important, because during the war, unless you had a good reason, you could not go and buy petrol. If you were using your vehicle for some part of war defence, you could get a certain amount of petrol, but otherwise you couldn't. If you just used it for pleasure, you couldn't get petrol. So a lot of people just jacked their cars up on bricks for the purpose of the war. So cycling was important, but again, if you had a headlight on your bike, you had to adjust the lamp so that the bottom part of the reflector was blacked out, so that no light would reflect up into the sky. And so you can have a bicycle lamp just to illuminate the road that you were cycling over. But you had to be very careful how strong your light was. And in fact, in January 1942, someone was fined 10 shillings because his bicycle beam extended 4 yards. Can you imagine? That's about that distance. It had to be straight down about 1 yard or 2 yards. So you could be fined if you had insufficient headlights, or fined if you had a light that went too far. You remember the Albins, David?
I do, yeah.
Well, Greta Albin, in June 1943, had a friend, probably in the Navy, and he brought her 3 bananas. Now, of course, during the war, you couldn't get bananas at all. There was no. So at the end of the war, when it was possible to go to a shop and buy bananas, young people didn't know what to do with them, and would probably just try to eat them skin and all. But somebody brought Greta Albin 3 bananas, and so she resisted the temptation to eat them, and she held a raffle and raised and this is in 1943, which is a lot of money. She raised £5, 18 shillings and 10 pence in a raffle for these 3 bananas for some good cause. So that was Greta. And in January 1940, the 3rd Filey Rangers, which are the Rangers Scouts or Guides?
I think the
Guides, I think.
Yeah,
the 3rd Filey Rangers held an event and held a dance, and the money they raised, they didn't give to a charity, they used it for washing evacuees' clothing.
Oh.
Because of course during the war that was a major thing, really. Because of course Filey water during the war was very hard, and you know where Filey water came from. It came from an artesian well, which is a very deep well, just outside the railway station.
I didn't know that.
Well, if you go up the access road to the railway station now, there are 1 or 2 buildings just on the left. Well, one of them contained the artesian well, which and so it was water that had gone down, because Filey is built on chalk, and chalk makes water very hard, and so water from an artesian well was always very hard, and therefore for limited soap or washing powder it was very hard to get any kind of lather, and so washing clothes was quite a major taking during today you just go to a shop, and Filey water is now quite soft, I think, because it comes from the system near Seymour somewhere, whereas Filey water actually came from an artesian well in Filey, and it was very hard. Yes, one of the ways in which money was raised, the Red Cross had a penny a week fund. You gave a penny a week to a fund for the Red Cross. The Butlins must have been quite busy at the time. In 1941, the Butlin staff had a Spitfire fund to raise money to buy a Spitfire. You could raise money for a particular cause, and I think a Spitfire was £5,000. So, and the Butlin staff in 1941 raised £554. So they bought, virtually the equivalent of a tenth of the Spitfire.
Yeah.
I am speaking to you from the Cabinet Room at 10 Downing Street. This morning, the British ambassador in Berlin handed the German government a final note stating that unless we heard from them by 11 o'clock, that they were prepared at once to withdraw their troops from Poland, a state of war would exist between us. I have to tell you now that no such undertaking has been received, and that consequently this country is at war with Germany.